The streets of London in the 1700s were no strangers to shadows, but there was one place where darkness seemed to settle thicker than anywhere else, a place known as Gin Alley. The name alone carried a weight that sent a chill down spines and a whisper through the crowded lanes. It was not just a street. It was a mirror reflecting a city caught in the grip of something that tasted sweet and burned slow. Gin, cheap and everywhere, had turned this corner of London into a place where laughter cracked like broken glass and cries often went unheard. As the lamps flickered weakly against the damp night air, people stumbled over cobblestones with bottles dangling from their hands, the smell of juniper and sour spirits mixing with smoke and sweat. London was changing fast in those years, swelling with people, noise, and poverty. And in the heart of it all, Gin Alley was breathing in that chaos and exhaling misery. It was a time when the city had become a patchwork of extremes. There were grand houses lit with chandeliers, their windows glowing like stars against the fog, and there were back streets like this, where even the moon seemed to hesitate to shine. The story of Gin Alley is not just about drink, it is about people, mothers, fathers, children, and strangers who all found themselves drawn into the same slow whirlpool. It is a story of survival in a place where the line between living and merely existing grew thin. There were men who came home with their wages clinking in their pockets and left again with empty hands, hoping the burn of a bottle might quiet the hunger in their stomach or the ache in their hearts. There were women who traded their last coin for a night of numbness, and there were children, small hands clutching at their mother's skirts, their eyes wide and hollow, already learning that the world could be cold before they had a chance to know it is warm. As you walk with me now, imagine the sound under your boots, the crunch of grit, the murmur of distant arguments, a baby's cry carried on the wind. The taverns are still open, their doors swinging like loose jaws, spilling out yellow light and laughter that never quite feels real. Inside, gin is poured in tin cups and cracked mugs, a liquid promise that costs almost nothing and yet takes nearly everything. The government, eager for taxes, had once encouraged this flood, but now even they whisper of its damage. They call it the gin craze, a storm of drink sweeping through alleys like this, and no one seems to know how to stop it. For some, it is a relief from a life of hard work and harder winters. For others, it is a curse that steals fathers from homes and leaves mothers staring at empty hearths. And for the city, it is a sickness that seeps into its bricks, staining them with something that will not wash away. Among these streets, there are faces you might remember if you look long enough. There is Margaret, who sells pies by day and drinks them away by night, her hands chapped and red, her laugh too loud for someone with so little. There is Thomas, a dock worker whose broad shoulders are bent now, his voice thick with promises he never keeps. And there is little Daniel, no more than 8, who runs errands for the gin shops, darting between legs and carts, a ghost of a boy with quick eyes and quicker feet. Each of them carries a piece of this place, each of them caught in the tide that makes Gin Alley what it is. They are not villains, nor are they saints. They are people trying to live in a city that grows more crowded and more expensive each day, where a penny can mean a meal or a drink, and sometimes the drink feels easier. The nights here are long, and the mornings come too quickly. When the first light slides over the rooftops, it does not always bring hope. Instead, it reveals the slump of bodies in doorways, the stillness of those who drank too much, the slow stirring of a city that does not have time to rest. Shopkeepers sweep their steps, mothers hush their babies, and somewhere a bell tolls for a service that few will attend. The smell of baking bread drifts faintly over the alleys, but it is drowned by the sharp tang of cheap spirits and smoke. The city is alive, but in Gin Alley, it is a restless, uneasy life, one that feels as though it is waiting for something, a change, a reckoning, or perhaps just the next bottle. There are whispers, of course, as there always are in places like this. Whispers of a new law that might stop the sale of gin. Whispers of patrols cracking down on taverns that stay open too late. Whispers of a preacher who walks these streets with a Bible in his hand, telling anyone who will listen that this path leads nowhere good. But for now, the bottles still clink, The coins still change hands, and the alley still hums with its strange, heavy music. There's a tension in the air, the kind that comes before a storm, and everyone feels it, even if they do not speak it. On one such night, damp with rain and heavy with the scent of soot, a figure moved through the alley with his collar pulled high. He was not from here, not really. His coat was better than most, his boots less worn, and his eyes, well, his eyes were the kind that notice things. He passed the tavern doors, glanced at the windows with their paper curtains, and paused where the shadows thickened. There, in the hush between laughter and shouting, something caught his attention. A door ajar where there should have been none, a soft sound like a gasped swallow by the dark. He stepped closer, though he could not yet see what waited beyond. The night seemed to hold its breath, and that is where we find ourselves, standing with him at the edge of a story that has only just begun. London in the 1700s was a city of great wealth and deep hunger, a place where the same street could smell of roast beef and rot, perfume and sewage. Gin Alley was its beating heart of despair, but it was also a place of moments, small acts of kindness, foolish hopes, and choices that could change everything. What lay behind that door? Who waited in the gloom? Was it a cry for help or a trap set by desperate hands? The alley does not give answers easily. It asks you to step closer, to listen, to see for yourself what happens when a city drinks too deeply of its own troubles. The night is not yet over, and the story of Gin Alley is far from finished. Somewhere in the warren of streets, a clock strikes midnight, and the sound rolls like a warning through the fog. Tomorrow may bring laws, or riots, or nothing at all. But tonight, here, in this crooked place where the lamplight flickers and the stones are slick with rain, something is stirring. Something that will make even the most stubborn drunk set down his cup and listen. Something that might just be the beginning of the end, or the start of a new descent. For now, the door remains open. The figure steps forward, and the alley holds its secrets close, waiting for the next move. The door creaked wider as the man stepped closer, the sound cutting through the rain-soaked stillness of Gin Alley. His boots met the slick stone, and for a moment, the street seemed to pause with him. Inside, the dim glow of a single candle trembled, casting long shadows across a narrow room that smelled of damp wood and bitter spirits. He hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because in a place like this, hesitation was often wiser than courage. His name was Samuel, a clerk by trade, drawn here not by drink, but by worry. His brother had not come home for 3 nights, and each whisper he followed led him back to this wretched stretch of London where the gin was cheapest and the nights longest. Samuel had seen Gin Alley from a distance before, but never like this. Never when the hours stretched long past decent company and the air hung heavy with secrets. The stories he had heard were enough to sour a man's sleep. Mothers leaving infants by the roadside, wages lost in a single sitting, men vanishing with their pockets turned inside out. Yet here he was, breathing it in, trying to piece together a path that might lead him to answers. His brother, Robert, was not the sort to disappear willingly. Hard-headed, yes. Fond of a drink, occasionally. But gone for 3 days? That was a silence too deep to ignore. Inside the narrow room, a woman sat hunched over a table. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair pulled loose, and her eyes half closed as though sleep was a luxury she had forgotten. She looked up at him, slow and cautious, and her lips parted as if to speak, but only a rasp came out. Beside her, a child stirred in the corner, wrapped in a blanket that did little against the damp. Samuel's eyes swept the room, searching for a sign of his brother. But all he found was the same story written 100 times over: emptiness, hunger, and the ghost of what had once been a family. Looking for someone? The woman asked at last, her voice rough like gravel. She lifted a cup to her lips, grimaced as if even the gin had turned sour, and set it down again. "My brother," Samuel said. "Robert Hale. Tall, dark coat, quick with his words. Have you seen him?" The woman shook her head, slow and weary. "Plenty come through here, mister. Plenty go missing too. Hard to keep the name straight." She gestured to the door behind her, half hidden by a hanging sheet. "But if he was here, he'd be in there. Or worse. The word hung in the air like smoke. Worse. Samuel didn't ask her to explain. He knew enough already of what Gin Alley could do to a man. He thanked her, though she had given him little, and stepped back into the night. Outside, the rain had eased, but the fog had thickened. Figures moved like wraiths along the street, some clutching bottles, others clutching each other, their laughter brittle as cracked glass. The tavern across the way burst in a sudden noise as a fight spilled out its door, two men grappling, a woman shouting for them to stop. A constable passed by, his lamp swinging, his eyes fixed ahead. He did not stop the fight. He did not even slow his step. In these alleys, trouble was like rain, constant and not worth cursing. Samuel pulled his coat tighter and walked on. He thought of the London beyond these streets. The clean-lit parlors where polite society whispered of the gin problem. The coffee houses where men argued over trade and taxes. The grand squares where gas lamps burned bright and children were tucked safely in bed. It felt like another city altogether, a place he might have dreamed if not for the mud on his boots and the sour tang still in his nose. The paper spoke of reform, of new laws to curb the drinking, of moral societies handing out pamphlets that no one here would ever read. But what were words to a woman with no bread? What was law to a man whose only warmth was the fire in a bottle? He turned a corner and nearly stumbled over a figure crouched against the wall. A boy, no older than 10, thin as a stray cat. His clothes were patched and filthy, his hands stained with something that might have been ink or ash. He looked up with quick, wary eyes. "You got a coin, sir?" the boy asked, his voice a whisper lost in the fog. Samuel paused, then knelt. "What's your name?" "Daniel," the boy said, rubbing his nose with the back of his hand. "I can tell you where to find what you're looking for. For a penny." Samuel hesitated. It could be a trick. In these streets it often was. But the boy's gaze was sharp, too sharp for idle begging. "I'm looking for my brother," Samuel said. "Robert Hale." Daniel nodded, as if he already knew. "I seen him. A few nights back. Went with a man to the gin shop by the mill. Ain't come out since." The boy held out his hand, and Samuel gave him the penny. It was worth it, even if the trail was cold. "Show me," he said. They walked together through the maze of alleys, Daniel darting ahead like a shadow, Samuel following with his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. The gin shop by the mill was no better than the rest. Low roof, crooked door, a sign half fallen from its nail. But as they drew near, Samuel felt something shift. The noise here was different, less rowdy, more hushed. The air smelled faintly of damp grain and rot. Daniel stopped short. "This is as far as I go," the boy whispered. "They don't like strangers asking questions." Samuel reached out, but the boy was already gone, slipping between barrels and into the mist. Alone now, Samuel pushed open the door. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from a low fire in the grate. A few men sat hunched at tables, their faces lost in shadow, their cups half empty. Behind the counter, a man with a scar across his cheek looked up, his eyes sharp as pins. "Help you?" he asked. Samuel swallowed. "I'm looking for my brother. Robert Hale. Has he been here?" The man's expression did not change. "Plenty come through here. Names don't mean much in this place." Samuel stepped closer. "Please, I need to find him. I think something's happened." For a moment, the room was silent but for the crackle of the fire. Then the man behind the counter leaned in, his voice low. "If you're smart, you'll leave now. Some doors, once opened, don't close so easy." Samuel felt a chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the way they were said, flat and final, like a man warning of a hole in the road you cannot see. But he did not turn back. Not yet. He had come too far, and his brother's name still hung in the air like a question with no answer. Outside, the fog thickened further, wrapping the alley in a gray veil. Somewhere a church bell rang, though it was long past midnight. Somewhere else, a baby cried and then fell silent. Samuel stood in the doorway of that crooked gin shop, torn between the safety of retreat and the pull of something darker. He knew, as all who walked these streets knew, that Gin Alley did not give up its secrets without taking something in return. And just then, before he could take a step forward or back, he heard it. A faint sound muffled from behind the wall. A voice, a struggle, a name whispered, or perhaps a plea. He could not be sure, but it was enough to make his hand reach for the latch of the inner door. Enough to make the scarred man behind the counter tense, as though he, too, had heard it. The night held still, the air heavy with smoke and waiting. Something was about to break. Whether it was a door, a promise, or Samuel's own resolve, he did not yet know. But he felt, with a sudden sharpness, that he was not only looking for his brother now. He was standing on the edge of a story much larger than himself, a story of a city drowning not in water, but in its own thirst. And Gin Alley was only the beginning. Samuel's fingers hovered over the latch, the cold iron damp beneath his touch. The room behind him seemed to retreat, the crackle of the fire softening, the mutter of the few patrons dimming until all he could hear was his own heartbeat, heavy and uncertain. That faint sound from behind the wall, it hadn't been his imagination. There was something there, something that didn't belong to the quiet decay of a late-night gin shop. It had weight, urgency, a pulse of its own. The scarred man behind the counter shifted his stance, the wood beneath his boots creaking. "Best leave it," he muttered, his voice low and measured, as though speaking too loud might wake something sleeping. "Whatever's behind that door is for them, not for you." Samuel turned slightly, his eyes catching the flicker of the firelight on the man's scar. "Them?" he asked. "Who is them?" But the man said nothing more. His jaw tightened, and he turned back to polishing a chipped glass, the cloth moving in small, nervous circles. It was the kind of silence that held more answers than words could. Samuel took a slow breath. He thought of his brother's laugh, the way Robert would tip his chair back when telling a story, the rough calluses on his hand from hauling crates along the docks. He thought of his mother's face, lined with worry when she had asked if there was any word yet. And then he thought of this alley, its stink of sour drink, its slick stones, its thin-faced children darting like rats, and how easily a man could vanish here without leaving even a whisper behind. He lifted the latch. The door swung inward with a reluctant groan, revealing a narrow passage lit by a single guttering candle. The air was colder here, and the smell changed, less of drink, more of earth, damp and metallic. He stepped in, his boots echoing softly on the uneven floor. Behind him, the door closed with a dull thud, leaving the mutter of the gin shop a distant memory. The passage led downward, a slight slope beneath his feet, and ended at another door, this one of rough wood reinforced with iron bands. From beyond it came that sound again, faint, a shuffle, a soft thud like a chair being overturned. Samuel pressed his ear to the wood. A voice, muffled but human, spoke a word he couldn't quite catch. His brother's name? Or just the echo of his own hopes? He knocked. The response was immediate. A sharp movement, a sudden hush, and then footsteps hurrying away. He tried the handle. Locked. "Robert," he hissed, his voice low but urgent. "Robert, are you in there?" No answer. Only the quiet that followed too quickly, too deliberately. Behind him, the passage felt suddenly closer, the walls damp and sweating. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the scarred man or one of the silent drinkers blocking his path. But the way was empty, only shadows creeping where the candle's light could not reach. He stepped back, weighing his options. He had no key, no plan, and no allies here. If he forced the door, he would bring every eye in Gin Alley upon him, and not the kind that offered help. Yet if he left it, if he walked away now, the chance might not come again. He remembered Daniel's eyes, the boy who had led him here, and the way they had darted to the corners as though someone were always listening. "They don't like strangers asking questions," the boy had said. Perhaps this was what he meant. Perhaps this was why Robert had not come home. Samuel turned toward the stairs, his jaw tight. For now, he needed to leave, to think, to find someone who would talk. Barging in blind would help no one. But as he reached the top of the passage and pushed open the door to the gin shop, a cold certainty settled in his chest. Whatever was behind that locked door was the reason his brother had vanished. The alley outside had changed in the short time he'd been gone. The fog lay thicker, the lamps guttered low, and a drizzle had begun again, fine as a cobweb. A cart rattled by, its wheels leaving deep ruts in the mud, and from a distant tavern came the shrill rise of a fiddle, playing a tune too fast for the hour. Samuel pulled up his collar and stepped into the street. His breath clouded before him as he retraced his steps, mind churning. Names, faces, places where Robert might have gone before the gin took him here. A friend at the docks, a foreman who owed him wages, a woman with whom he sometimes shared his evenings. Each a thread that might lead to the knot hidden in this alley. He did not notice the figure that followed him at first, a shadow that slipped from a gin shop door a few heartbeats after he left. Nor did he hear the soft scuff of boots on wet stone keeping pace a dozen steps behind. He stopped at a crossroads, the alleys branching like cracks in a wall, and chose the lane that would take him toward the broader streets and the weak promise of safety. The lamps here were fewer, their lights struggling against the mist, and the night pressed in with the weight of damp cloth. It was then he felt it, that prickle at the back of his neck, the sense of eyes on his spine. He quickened his pace. The footsteps behind him quickened too. He turned suddenly, his hand already clenched, but the alley was empty save for the fog. A cat leapt from a barrel, knocking it against the wall with a hollow bang, and the sound made his pulse jump. He waited a moment, listening, but the night gave nothing back except the faint drip of rain from the eaves. When he finally reached his own street, the one that smelled of bakeries and coal smoke rather than gin and despair, he almost believed he had imagined it. Almost. But when he closed his door and set the bolt, the echo of those footsteps still walked the length of his mind. The city slept fitfully that night. Somewhere in the higher quarters, the talk was of taxes and trade, of ships arriving from the Indies heavy with sugar and rum. Somewhere else, a preacher prepared his sermon, a magistrate signed an order, a child dreamed of bread. And in Gin Alley, the bottles emptied and filled again, the secrets shifted in their dark corners, and the locked door at the bottom of the passage held whatever truth Samuel had nearly touched. Morning came gray and slow, the sky a flat sheet above the chimney tops. Samuel woke with the taste of damp still in his mouth, and the image of that iron-banded door sharp in his mind. He had not found Robert, not yet, but he had found the scent of something larger than one man gone missing. Gin Alley was not merely a street of drink. It was a mouth that swallowed men whole, a place where silence was bought and sold as easily as a cup of spirits. And as he laced his boots and set out once more, he did not yet see the boy watching from across the square, or the scarred man standing in the shadow of a butcher's shop, or the way the city seemed, for a heartbeat, to hold its breath as though waiting for what he would do next. Samuel stepped out into the pale morning, the cobblestones slick with a thin sheen of dew. The city was stirring, but Gin Alley did not truly sleep, it only dimmed. Somewhere in its twisting heart, he imagined the bottles clinking again, the laughter returning, the whispers resuming as though night never truly ended there. He turned his coat collar up against the damp wind and set off with determined steps. His mind was fixed, though a part of him still lingered in that passage beneath the gin shop, on that locked door and the sound behind it. Robert was close. He could feel it, but the city had a way of swallowing closeness and stretching it into miles. The market square was already alive when he arrived, the clatter of carts and the cries of sellers breaking the morning's gray hush. Fishmongers laid their catches on wet planks. Bakers set out warm loaves that sent steam curling into the chill, and costermongers waved bunches of greens still damp with frost. Among them, Samuel spotted a man he knew, Jonas, a cooper from the docks, once a drinking companion of his brother's before the worst of the gin took hold. Jonas was bent over a barrel, his broad back hunched, his eyes quick and wary. "Jonas," Samuel called, stepping closer. "You've seen Robert, haven't you?" The cooper straightened slowly, wiping his hands on his apron. His face was lined more deeply than Samuel remembered, and there was a tightness in his mouth that spoke of nights gone rough. "I seen him," he said at last. "Few nights past, down by the mill. You looking to drag him home?" "I'm looking to make sure he still has one," Samuel said. Jonas frowned at that, glancing over his shoulder as though even the morning market had ears. "There's talk," he said quietly. "Men going missing. Not just drink taking them, not just the cold. Work promised, wages whispered, and then gone. Samuel's stomach tightened. Gone where? Jonas shook his head. Ask too loud, you'll go the same way. Best you take care where you walk, Sam. Gin Alley's got longer arms than it looks. He tried to press for more, but Jonas only turned back to his barrels, his shoulders closing like shutters. Samuel left with more questions than he had come with, his boots carrying him toward the river where the air smelled of tar and salt. The Thames was a dark, restless vein through the city, carrying trade and refuse alike. Barges groaned under their loads, ropes creaked, gulls cried overhead. Among the workers, Samuel spotted the boy, Daniel, the one with quick eyes and quicker feet. He was perched on a bollard, tossing crumbs to the birds, his hands already deep in someone's pockets by the look of them. You followed me, Samuel said as he approached. Daniel shrugged, a thin smile twitching his mouth. Didn't have to. You walk the same streets as the rest of us. Find anything. Only more fog, Samuel said, and a locked door. The boy's smile faded at that. He looked over his shoulder, then back at Samuel. You shouldn't have gone there. Why not? Samuel asked. My brother's in trouble. Your brother, Daniel said softly, made a choice. Everyone does. Some go in and don't come out. Some go in and come out different. Different how? Samuel pressed. The boy only shook his head. It's not the gin that ruins them. Not really. The gin's just the gate. Samuel crouched, lowering his voice. Then what's behind the gate? Daniel's eyes darted to the river, then back to the maze of streets behind them. You want answers, you don't ask in daylight. Come tonight. The old tannery by the edge of the alley. Bring no coin, just questions. And before Samuel could reply, the boy was gone again, slipping into the press of carts and cries like smoke in a chimney. The day dragged on, each hour slower than the last. Samuel returned to his rooms, but rest would not come. He walked the length of his floorboards until dusk, then until the lamps began to flicker on one by one, the city's heart quickening as darkness returned. Gin Alley thrived by night. That much he had learned. And if there were answers to be found, they would not wait for dawn. The tannery was a hulking ruin at the edge of the district, its windows boarded, its walls damp with years of neglect. The smell of old hides clung faintly to its stones, sour and heavy. Samuel slipped inside through a door that hung crooked on its hinges, his breath clouding in the cold interior. Shadows pooled in the corners, broken beams like ribs jutting from the floor. Here, a voice whispered. Daniel emerged from the dark, his eyes bright in the lamplight of a single lantern he held low. Behind him, two others waited, a woman with a shawl drawn tight, and a man whose face Samuel could not see beneath the brim of his hat. You wanted the truth, the boy said. You have to hear it quick, and you have to remember, no one speaks of this outside. The woman stepped forward. Her face was lined, her hands raw, but her voice carried a steady strength. They're taking men, she said, not just the drunk, but the desperate. They promise wages, dock work, mill work, even a sailor's berth. They give them gin, keep them soft, keep them quiet. And when the time comes, they vanish. Where do they go? Samuel asked. The man in the hat spoke now, his voice low. Some to ships, sent off to colonies they'll never see again. Some to workhouses that don't exist on any map. Some not even that. Gin Alley feeds them to whoever pays. Samuel felt the room sway slightly, the stench of the tannery growing thicker. And Robert? He asked. You've seen him? Daniel nodded slowly. He went through the door. The same one you found. If he's still alive, he's beyond it. A noise from outside cut their words short. The crunch of a boot on gravel. The faint clink of metal. The woman stiffened. The man drew back into the shadow, and the boy blew out the lantern in a single breath. Go, Daniel hissed. They're watching. Samuel slipped out the back, his heart pounding, the night now alive with the shapes of watchers that might or might not have been there. He did not run. Not here, not yet, but he moved quickly, keeping to the deeper shadows, the ones the lamps could not quite reach. As he neared the edge of the alley, he glanced back once. A figure stood at the far end, where the fog curled like smoke. It did not move. It only watched, and the glow of a pipe flared briefly before vanishing. By the time Samuel reached his rooms again, the streets were emptying of the day's noise. He leaned against his door, his breath ragged, his hands cold. The city beyond his window looked calm enough, the lamps steady, the bells silent. But he knew now that calm was only a mask. Beneath it, the same current that had taken Robert was reaching for more. He sat at his table, staring at the dark streets outside. The boy's warning echoed in his head. Some go in and don't come out. Some come out different. Robert was still out there. He had to be. But each hour the trail grew colder, and each hour the city seemed to learn more about Samuel than he knew about it. And somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled midnight, rolling over the rooftops like a slow, heavy tide. The streets of London in the early 1700s were restless, and not just because of the noise from the taverns. A strange unease had settled over the city, like fog that refused to lift. People whispered about how things had changed so quickly. Only a decade before, the city had been poor but steady, with its share of hardship, but also a rhythm people could follow. Now it felt like something had cracked beneath the surface. Gin was everywhere, cheap, burning, and relentless. It flowed through alleyways, shop fronts, and makeshift stalls like a river that no one wanted to dam. In the heart of this growing storm was Thomas Hargreaves, a weary shoemaker with calloused hands and a young daughter named Mary. Thomas had once believed that hard work could keep a family afloat, that steady hours at his cobbler's bench would put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. But as the city's taste for gin deepened, so did its appetite for neglect. Many of his customers paid less, came less, or spent what little they had on drink rather than repairs. It wasn't only his trade that was fading, it was the spirit of the people around him. The streets were louder at night, the laughter sharper, the cries more common. Mary would sit by the window of their narrow room and watch the passers-by below. She was only 9, yet her eyes carried a heaviness no child should know. Each evening, the same groups passed, women with flushed cheeks and bare feet, men stumbling with tankards still in hand, young boys pushing carts filled with empty bottles. The smell of juniper and cheap spirits drifted through the streets like a ghost, clinging to everyone who brushed by. Thomas hated that smell. It reminded him of promises broken, of wages vanished before they reached the kitchen table. What made it worse was how ordinary it had all become. Gin wasn't just a drink. It was an answer. A mother gave it to her crying infant to make him sleep. A laborer drank it to forget his aching back. A widow used it to silence her grief. People said it warmed them in winter, cured their hunger, soothed their fear. But Thomas saw something else. The empty shops, the dark eyes of children left alone, the fights breaking out in alleys where once neighbors had talked kindly. It was as if London had fallen under a spell, and no one wanted to wake up. Not everyone accepted this new life without question. In a small coffee house by Fleet Street, a group of men gathered every Thursday evening to discuss the city's decline. They were not wealthy, nor powerful, but they were restless. Among them was Samuel Carter, a writer whose pamphlets had started to circulate in the markets. He wrote about the gin madness, warning of a future where London would drown in its own vice. His words were bold for a man of modest means, and they drew both curious glances and quiet threats. One damp evening, Thomas found himself in that coffee house, drawn by the rumor of free bread and warm tea. He listened as Samuel spoke of families undone, of streets where children begged for coins while their parents slept off the night before. Samuel's voice trembled not with fear, but with urgency. "It is not the drink alone," he said, leaning forward so the lamplight caught his tired face. "It is the forgetting of duty, of neighbor, of tomorrow. We sell it cheaply now, but we will pay dearly later." Thomas said little that night, but the words clung to him as he walked home through the mist. He thought of Mary's thin blanket, of the cold in her small fingers. He thought of his wife, gone these 3 years, who had once sung softly as she mended their clothes. Would she have seen this coming? Would she have begged him to take Mary and leave the city behind? Or would she, too, have believed that things would turn if only they worked harder, if only they endured? In the shadows of Gin Alley, a different kind of gathering was taking place. Behind the boarded windows of a crumbling inn, a man named Elias Prentice counted his earnings. He was a gin seller and proud of it. To him, the drink was not a curse but an opportunity. Where others saw ruin, he saw profit. The more desperate the people became, the more they came to him. He bought the cheapest spirits, mixed them with turpentine or oil of vitriol when supplies ran low, and sold them by the pint to whoever had a penny. His eyes were sharp and his smile quick, but there was no warmth behind it. Some nights, Thomas passed Prentice's and on his way to deliver shoes, and the noise inside chilled him more than the cold. Laughter, crying, shouting, it all blended together until it felt like the walls themselves were alive. Once he thought he heard a baby wailing inside, but when the door swung open, the sound was lost in the roar of voices and the stench of spilled drink. London's authorities had begun to notice the change too, though their response was slow and uncertain. New taxes were whispered about, new laws drafted, but each time a measure was proposed, another merchant protested or another official turned his head. After all, the gin trade filled pockets as much as it emptied souls. And for the poor, it was often the only comfort they could afford. Who would dare take that away? As winter deepened, the city seemed to shrink under its own weight. Fires burned low in the grates, fog crept through the streets, and yet the taverns stayed full. Mothers held their children close, hoping the cold would pass quickly. Men stumbled home with wages already spent. The night watch patrolled with weary eyes, pretending not to hear the cries that sometimes echoed from the narrowest lanes. It was on one of those nights that Thomas returned home later than usual, the soles of his boots slick with mud and frost. Mary was already asleep, her small frame curled against the wall. He stood for a long moment, staring at her, wondering how long they could hold on. Outside, a shout rose in the distance, followed by the crash of glass. He did not go to the window. He had seen enough. Yet something inside him stirred, a restlessness not unlike the one that drove Samuel Carter to write, or that pushed the men in the coffee house to meet again and again. It was the feeling that this could not last, that something would have to give. Whether that something would be the drink, the people, or the city itself, Thomas could not yet tell. The streets of Gin Alley slept uneasily that night. Somewhere a bottle shattered. Somewhere else a child cried. And in the cold hush before dawn, the city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a change it could not yet name. Would the men at the coffee house find a way to stir the city awake? Would the merchants tighten their grip, or would the people finally begin to resist the poison flowing so freely through their hands? For now, the answer remained as murky as the gin that filled the cups, and the dawn brought only more shadows. By the time the night had fully claimed London, the damp streets glistened like polished stone under the dim flicker of oil lamps. Gin Alley was no different, though here, the light seemed to struggle against the shadows. The lanes twisted like the roots of an ancient tree, each one lined with creaking taverns and crumbling houses. People moved between them with heavy steps, their boots leaving marks in the mud, their breath misting in the cold air. A thin drizzle had begun, clinging to the air like a ghost that refused to leave. The whispers about the gin trade were louder than ever. It was said that barrels arrived, not only from legal sellers, but also from mysterious barges along the Thames. No one knew exactly who controlled the flow, only that it came steadily and cheaply, keeping the alley supplied and the people dulled. The promise of a quick escape from reality drew even the strongest-willed. And yet, behind the laughter and the smell of strong drink, there was something else, a sense of unease, as though the city itself was keeping a secret. Edward had begun to notice changes in familiar faces. Mary, the seamstress who once walked proudly with her head high, now shuffled past him in the street, her eyes unfocused. Old Mr. Finch, who used to greet every neighbor with a cheerful word, now muttered to himself by the tavern door, a tin cup always in his hand. Children, too, played near the gutters, their small fingers tracing shapes in the dirt as their parents drank behind closed doors. The air was thick with a sadness that no one dared name aloud. In the midst of this, new figures started to appear in the alley. A man in a dark coat, too fine for the neighborhood, was seen speaking quietly with the tavern keepers. His boots were always clean despite the mud, and he never stayed long enough to draw too much attention. A woman with a hooded shawl, her hands hidden, often walked the lanes at night, slipping notes beneath doors. Who were they? No one seemed to know, but their presence stirred the alley's quiet fears. London in the 1700s was a city of contrasts. Wealthy houses stood only streets away from broken roofs and hungry mouths. The gin craze thrived in the spaces between, feeding off despair and distraction. While Parliament debated regulations and pamphlets warned of moral decay, the people of places like Gin Alley lived the reality daily. They traded pennies for a mug, sometimes selling their last loaf of bread just to feel warm again. And still, more taverns opened, more barrels rolled in, and the nights grew louder. Sarah found herself drawn into this current without meaning to. After her brother's illness worsened, she had started visiting the apothecary more often, hoping for some remedy or comfort. There, she overheard stories, murmurs of gin being mixed with strange substances, of sellers cutting corners to stretch their profits. Some said the drink was not just strong, it was changing people. At first, she dismissed it as rumor, the kind of talk that floats in poor neighborhoods. But when her neighbor collapsed in the street one cold morning, his breath heavy with the same sour scent, she began to wonder. There were nights when the alley grew too quiet, when even the taverns closed their shutters earlier than usual. Those were the nights Sarah lay awake, listening for footsteps outside her door. The strange man in the dark coat had passed by twice that week, his shadow stretching across her window. Edward, too, had seen him, and though they never spoke of it openly, both felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The newspapers carried small notes about the growing problem. Gin Lane in decline. One headline read, accompanied by an illustration of hollow-eyed figures stumbling through the streets. The article spoke of public order, of concern for the city's future, but it never named names, never pointed to who truly profited. To the people living there, it was just another piece of paper that would soon line the bottom of a drawer. What they felt was not just decline, it was a slow, creeping change that ate at the corners of their days. Even the church bells seemed to toll differently now. They rang, but the sound was thinner, more distant. Priests spoke against the drink from their pulpits, urging families to return to the old ways, to spend their coins on bread instead of spirits. Yet the tavern stayed full. For many, a sermon could not warm the body nor quiet the gnawing hunger. Gin could. It was cheaper than beer, quicker to dull the pain, and easier to forget with. And forgetting was what many needed most. On one particularly damp evening, a heavy fog rolled in from the river, swallowing the alley in a pale, cold mist. Sarah was on her way back from a brief errand when she noticed something strange. Near the edge of the alley, by the crooked lamppost that had long ceased to work, a group had gathered. Their faces were hidden by the mist, their voices low. She couldn't hear the words, only the tone, a hurried, secretive exchange. One figure handed something to another, a small pouch or paper, before melting back into the fog. She hurried home, heart quickening, the image burned into her mind. What was being passed through these streets? Was it only gin or something more? That night she dreamed of barrels rolling endlessly down the lanes, their contents spilling into the gutters, turning the cobblestones slick. Faces she knew floated past, their eyes vacant, their hands reaching. And somewhere in the fog, the man in the dark coat watched, his expression unreadable. Days passed, but the feeling did not leave. Edward, too, had noticed the alley's strange rhythm. How certain doors stayed open longer, how some taverns drew new faces while others fell silent. He began asking quiet questions, not too directly, just enough to test the waters. Most shrugged him off. Others gave a look that told him to stop asking. It was as if the alley had learned to keep its own secrets, even from its own people. The winter deepened, and with it came more shadows. The river carried strange smells at night, and the barges grew more frequent. Somewhere beyond those streets, decisions were being made, by merchants, by men in fine clothes, perhaps even by those who claimed to serve the crown. But here, in the narrow heart of London, the consequences were plain. Each night, the alley drank a little more, and each morning it woke a little weaker. There was a sense now, creeping through the damp walls and crooked beams, that something was building. It wasn't only the drink. It was the way people looked over their shoulders before speaking, the way children played quieter when certain footsteps approached, the way fog seemed to linger longer over the cobblestones. Sarah and Edward found themselves watching, waiting, unsure of what they were waiting for, but unable to turn away. And somewhere beneath the surface, the story of Gin Alley was still being written, not by the city's leaders or the writers in their warm rooms, but by the people who walked its uneven stones each day. Some would try to escape. Others would be caught in the tide. For now, the alley held its breath, the mist curling around its doorways like a warning not yet spoken. Something was coming, and though no one could name it, they felt it all the same. The days in Gin Alley often began in a haze and ended in something far worse. As the 1700s dragged on, the rhythm of the streets became a grim symphony, bottles clinking, arguments breaking out, children crying in cold alleyways, and a dull fog of gin that seemed to wrap around everything like a second skin. The city was growing, expanding, reaching for the future, but here in the heart of London, progress came with a bitter taste. It was a time when the poor stayed poor, the rich stayed distant, and between them lay this stretch of cobbled misery, where drink was both an escape and a trap. Beneath the shadowed eaves of cramped taverns, the talk was rarely cheerful. Old men, their hands trembling, would sit hunched over cloudy glasses, muttering about better days that perhaps never truly existed. Women, many barely out of their youth, bore the lines of hardship that made them look twice their age. They stood in doorways, sometimes laughing, sometimes silent, watching the world stumble by. Gin was everywhere, cheap, strong, and easier to find than clean water. It was poured, traded, even given to infants to keep them quiet through long nights. This drink had become a part of life, as common as bread, but far more dangerous. Edward walked through the alley one damp morning, the fog clinging to his coat. He had grown used to the stench of sour spirits mixed with ash and refuse, but it never truly left his mind. Each corner seemed to whisper of some story gone wrong, lives bent and broken, promises unkept. The government had tried to stem the flood with taxes and regulations, but greed and demand always found a way. Distillers worked in cramped back rooms, their barrels hidden beneath loose floorboards or behind false walls, and the supply never really stopped. Margaret, carrying a bundle of herbs wrapped in coarse cloth, stopped near the old steps where she often set up her small trade. She sold simple remedies, bitter teas, powders to calm the stomach, even charms that some believed would ward off bad luck. She was no doctor, and she never claimed to be, but she knew the signs of sickness brought on by too much drink. The shaking hands, the yellowing eyes, the strange forgetfulness that left men wandering streets they had walked all their lives. Her mother had warned her once that places like this would swallow the strong and break the weak, and now, as she looked around, she wondered if anyone ever truly escaped. There was a boy, too, no older than 12, named Thomas, who ran errands for the tavern owners. Quick with his feet and quicker with his wits, he darted between grown men who slumped against walls or sprawled in doorways. He had seen more in his short life than many would in twice that time, and yet there was still something in his eyes, a restless curiosity, a spark that hadn't yet been smothered by the heavy air of Gin Alley. He listened, he watched, and he remembered. The world might forget children like him, but he was learning to remember for himself. Rumors began to spread as summer pressed on. People whispered that a sickness was moving through the alley, something worse than the usual fevers that came with bad air and dirty water. It was said to begin with a weariness in the bones, a slow drag that no amount of drink could lift. Then came the confusion, the trembling, the nights of restless wandering. Some blamed the cheap gin. Some said it was punishment for a city's sins. Others said it was nothing new at all, just the same old misery wearing a different face. Edward had his doubts. He had seen what unchecked drinking could do, how it hollowed men out from the inside, but this felt different somehow. He watched as a man he had known for years, a cobbler who once fixed his boots, stumbled into the alley one afternoon, pale as the London sky. The man's hands shook so violently he could barely hold his cup, yet he kept drinking, desperate for the warmth that would not come. By morning, he was gone. No one said where he had gone or why, only that his bed was empty and the alley a little quieter. Margaret noticed it too. Her herbs did little to ease this strange affliction. The usual bitter draughts that soothed aching bellies had no effect here. She began asking questions, carefully at first, so as not to draw the wrong kind of attention. The tavern keepers didn't like questions, and neither did the men who supplied them with barrels at night. But Margaret had seen enough mothers bury their sons, enough wives lose husbands to the bottle, to know that something darker was at work. As the days grew shorter and the nights stretched on, the alley seemed to hold its breath. The fog lingered longer now, curling like pale fingers around the corners of buildings. The laughter that once spilled from tavern doors had thinned to a dull murmur. Even Thomas, bold as he was, began to take longer routes home, avoiding the narrowest lanes where shadows stretched unnaturally long. One evening, as rain slicked the stones and lanterns flickered in the breeze, Edward met Margaret beneath the cracked sign of the Crow and Lantern. He had a question in his eyes, one he had carried for days. "Have you noticed it too?" he asked quietly. She only nodded, clutching her bundle closer. There was no need to explain what it was. Everyone who lived here had felt the shift. They spoke in hushed tones, the way people do when they fear the walls themselves might be listening. The alley had a way of swallowing secrets, but sometimes it spat them back out when least expected. As they talked, Thomas passed by, his small frame barely visible in the dim light. He caught a fragment of their words and paused, curiosity tugging at him like a string. Something was changing in Gin Alley, and even a boy could sense the tension. The city beyond seemed oblivious. The carriages rolled on, the markets bustled, and the grand houses of the wealthy glowed with candlelight. But here, in this forgotten stretch of London, a quiet dread was setting in. It was not the loud chaos of riots or the sharp crack of sudden violence. It was something slower, more patient. It moved in whispers and heavy footsteps, in empty doorways and half-finished songs. Edward found himself lying awake at night, listening to the creak of his ceiling beams and the distant hum of taverns still awake long past midnight. He thought of the cobbler, of the mothers who sold their last possessions for another pint, of the children who learned to beg before they could read. The alley had always been cruel, but now it felt watchful, as if waiting for something to happen. And in that waiting, fear grew. It clung to the fog, it seeped through the cracks in the walls, it followed the sound of glass against wood. No one could say when it would break, only that it was coming. Margaret dreamed of a night when the streets would be empty, not with sleep but with absence, and she would wake to find even the familiar faces gone. Thomas dreamed too, though he never spoke of what he saw, shadows moving like men, and men moving like shadows. By the time the autumn rains began to fall, the name Gin Alley had become more than a place. It was a warning, a curse, a whisper passed between travelers who hurried past with their collars turned up. And for those who lived there, it was a weight they carried in their bones. What had started as cheap comfort was turning into something far more sinister, and the people who once raised their cups in defiance now kept their eyes low, waiting for the next story to unfold. The following days blurred together as the city's damp breath seemed to hang heavier over the streets, carrying whispers of what Gin Alley had become. Margaret found herself more deeply entwined in the lives of those she had once passed with only a polite nod or averted glance. The cobbler's wife, once cheerful, now stared blankly out of her doorway, a baby crying weakly in her arms, while her husband lay inside, too dulled by drink to notice the cries. The butcher had started watering down his cuts, hoping to stretch his earnings in a neighborhood where coins were spent first on the cheap poison that clouded the mind. And the old widow, who used to hum softly as she swept her doorstep, had not opened her shutters in days. London was not just drinking. It was sinking quietly, slowly, in a haze that wrapped itself around every tired soul. As Margaret walked the narrow alleys, the familiar cobblestones felt like they were shifting under her feet. The same streets that had once been alive with children's games and market cries now echoed with hollow laughter, songs sung too loud to hide the emptiness beneath them. She passed a group of men huddled in the cold, their cheeks flushed, their eyes red, muttering about debts and mischances. One of them, young enough to still have dreams, clutched a small bottle like it held answers he could not find anywhere else. It was easier, he said, to forget for a few hours than to try and change what felt unchangeable. There were rumors, of course. There always were in a city like London. Some said the government had seen the profits rise and turn a blind eye. Others whispered that the gin itself was cursed, that barrels arrived with something more than just grain and water mixed within. Priests preached about sin, merchants counted their coins, and mothers kept their heads down as their children learned too early how to quiet a stomach that growled with nothing more than a sip from a shared glass. The air was thick with excuses and fears, and no one could tell which weighed more. Thomas kept a close watch on Margaret during those nights, though she hardly noticed at first. He seemed to appear when the shadows grew longest, always with a cautious word or a quiet warning about which corners to avoid. His hands were rough, stained with ink from the ledgers he kept by day, but his eyes carried the same weariness she saw in so many others. Only his had a sharper edge. He knew the numbers behind the bottles, the shipments that arrived before dawn, the money that slipped through unseen hands. Yet he never spoke too much, as if afraid the walls might lean in to listen. One evening, as the bells tolled in the distance and the fog rolled thick over the bridge, Margaret asked him why he stayed, why he hadn't left for somewhere quieter, safer. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the lamps flicker in the alley, their light bending strangely through the mist. "Because this is where the truth is," he said finally. "And someone has to remember it, even if no one else wants to." His words lingered long after he disappeared into the turning street, leaving her with a chill that no shawl could warm. The nights grew longer. More carts rattled past, carrying men who had fallen ill, their breaths shallow and eyes closed, while the taverns kept their doors wide, their tables lined with more glasses than plates. Some said the drink was medicine for the cold. Others called it courage for the dark times ahead. But Margaret began to see it for what it was, a slow trade, a bargain where the soul paid more than the coin ever could. She wrote about it in her small book by the candlelight, careful with her words, but unable to stop her hand from shaking when she described the faces she saw each day. There was a strange hush about the city that winter, as if it were holding its breath. Those who still worked did so, with their heads low, avoiding the alleys that had become too loud or too quiet, depending on the hour. Children disappeared from doorsteps, sent to live with distant relatives, or simply lost to the streets. The river carried more than just the tide now. It carried whispers of what was coming, and not all of them were clear. Some spoke of laws to curb the flow of gin, others of unrest brewing in the poorer quarters, where hunger and drink made for dangerous company. Margaret found herself drawn more and more to the stories behind the faces. She lingered in doorways, listened to arguments through thin walls, caught fragments of conversations that seemed innocent until she pieced them together later. A woman blamed the cold for her empty pantry, but her eyes darted to a bottle on the shelf. A boy boasted of his father's strong drink, but his voice cracked when he mentioned the bruises he hid beneath his collar. Every story had another story behind it, and every bottle left a shadow longer than its neck. On a particularly bitter night, with frost creeping over the windows, Margaret stumbled upon a small crowd gathered in the square. A man stood there, shouting about reform, his voice hoarse but determined. He waved a pamphlet that spoke of moderation, of turning away from the drink that had made their streets hollow. Some listened, some jeered, and some simply stared as though the words had passed them by. A stone clattered near his feet, then another, and soon the crowd broke apart. Not because they were convinced, but because they were tired. Tired of promises, tired of sermons, tired of waking to the same cold morning with the same empty shelves. The more Margaret watched, the more she felt the weight of something unseen pressing in from all sides. It was not just about the gin, though the bottles lined every step of the story. It was about the cracks that had been there long before, the poverty, the hunger, the walls built too high between those who had and those who had not. The drink was just the quickest way to stop feeling them, even for a moment. And in that moment of quiet, the city forgot to ask why. But forgetting came with a price. Each night, the streets grew quieter in the wrong way. The laughter was sharper, the silences longer. Rumors turned to warnings whispered by candlelight, names spoken only behind closed doors. Margaret could feel the turning point coming, though she could not see its shape. She wrote more, walked farther, listened harder. There was something waiting in the fog, something more than the cold or the drink, something that the city was too dazed to notice until it was too late. And one night, as the wind howled through the crooked chimneys, she found herself standing in the middle of Gin Alley once again, the stones slick with frost and the lamps burning low. A figure moved at the far end, pausing just long enough to make her heart quicken. It wasn't Thomas, and it wasn't anyone she knew. The stranger turned, the light catching his coat just enough to show the glint of something metallic in his hand, something not meant for comfort or warmth. Before she could call out, he slipped into the shadows, leaving only the echo of his steps behind. The city was changing, and Margaret was beginning to realize that not everyone wanted it to be saved. Some thrived in the fog, and others hid in it. And somewhere in between, the truth she sought was waiting, cold, patient, and not yet ready to be told. The night air in Gin Alley had a weight to it now, a thickness that clung to the skin and carried the sourness of spilled liquor, damp straw, and human fatigue. Nights had a way of stretching longer here, as if time slowed when the lamps burned low and the streets filled with the restless shuffle of souls caught between survival and ruin. Children moved among the alleys like shadows with bare feet, clutching scraps of bread or the rims of old mugs to catch the last drops of gin from careless drinkers. Mothers leaned against doorways, their hands rubbing their temples as if to keep the world from slipping apart. Men, their boots caked with mud and spirits, wandered from tavern to tavern in search of one more round to soften the cold creeping in from the Thames. Eleanor moved carefully through the crowd, her shawl pulled close to her shoulders. She had spent the last weeks listening, watching, trying to make sense of how this place had become what it was. She spoke little, asked even less, but her eyes missed nothing. The gin sellers had made promises of warmth and ease. A single penny for a mug, a promise of forgetting for a night. But the price paid was never in coins alone. It was in the way bodies slumped in corners, in the coughing that never quite stopped, in the quiet sobs of families who had lost yet another day's wages to the glass. The main street of Gin Alley was a crooked vein of life, lined with wooden buildings that leaned toward one another, as if conspiring in the dark. Above, laundry hung like tired flags, and below, men argued over debts they couldn't repay. Some corners were bright with noise, music, laughter that never quite sounded genuine, while others were silent, with only the scurrying of rats to break the stillness. It was in one of these quieter places that Eleanor found Thomas, a printer who had been trying to raise his voice against the spread of cheap spirits. He held a small pamphlet in his hand, the ink still damp, warning of the ruin creeping across the city. His fingers trembled as he passed it to her. "They call me mad for writing this," he whispered. "But it's not madness that fills these streets. It's something else, something deeper. They've made a trade of despair, and no one wants to see it." Eleanor looked down at the page. It spoke of distilleries working day and night, of taverns turning a blind eye to the faces of those who could barely stand, of debts that turned families into strangers. It wasn't only about drink. It was about the slow unraveling of a city's heart. Further down the alley, a commotion stirred near one of the larger taverns. A man had collapsed, his mug slipping from his hand into the mud. His friends argued over whether to lift him or leave him, their voices harsh with the same bitterness that burned in their throats. No one called for a doctor. Few could afford one, and fewer still believed one could help. Instead, they lifted him by his coat and dragged him into the shadows, out of sight. The crowd barely paused. It was not the first time. It would not be the last. There were whispers that night of new laws being spoken in Parliament, of officials debating whether the flood of gin could be slowed. But in the streets, law was an echo, and echoes did little to change empty stomachs or cold nights. For every voice like Thomas's, there were 10 more who shouted over him, selling dreams in small glasses and collecting coins by the handful. Eleanor had begun to follow the routes of the delivery carts, noting where the barrels came from, how easily they passed from hand to hand, how few questions were asked. Some distillers operated openly, their windows glowing well past midnight, their doors guarded by men with quick tempers and quicker hands. Others brewed in cellars, their fires hidden, their smoke drifting quietly up the cracks in the cobbles. And then there were the children, always the children. They learned quickly which alleys were safe and which ones were not, when to run and when to linger. Some carried small jugs for their parents, others sold the last cups of the night for a penny and a crust of bread. Many had lost track of their ages. Days bled into one another when the only measure of time was how long it took the bottles to empty. One evening, Eleanor crossed paths with Margaret again. The older woman was sitting on a step, her hands wrapped in cloth against the chill. Her boy, who had been lively just weeks before, now lay in a thin blanket beside her, his face pale, his breathing uneven. She looked up at Eleanor with eyes that had grown older in a matter of days. "They said it would keep him warm," Margaret murmured. "A little sip, that's all. Now he sleeps more than he wakes. I don't know what to do." Eleanor knelt beside her, unsure of what comfort she could offer. The alley stretched on behind them, its lamps flickering, its noise rolling like distant thunder. Somewhere in the dark, a man was shouting, and a door slammed shut. Somewhere else, a laugh rose too high and broke into a cough. The city was alive, but in a way that felt more like a fever than a heartbeat. As the weeks passed, the signs of something larger began to show. There were more fights breaking out in the streets, more patrols that never seemed to stay long enough to matter, more families whispering about debts and missing coins. The tavern keepers spoke of new taxes, the distillers of shortages that never quite arrived, the people of hope that never quite stayed. Thomas pressed on with his pamphlets, though the stack by his side never seemed to grow lighter. Each time he spoke, his words met either blank stares or muttered warnings. "You'll find trouble if you keep at this," someone told him one cold morning. He only nodded, his jaw tight. The conflict was no longer just about drink. It was about what the drink allowed, what it excused, what it covered. Secrets moved through these streets as easily as the spirits did. Deals made in back rooms, names spoken only when the doors were shut, debts paid in favors that could not be refused. For Eleanor, each night revealed another thread, but every thread led deeper into the same knot. A city willing to close its eyes if the glass stayed full. And then there were the whispers of those who profited most. Merchants who never stepped foot in the alleys, yet counted their coins by the thousands. Officials who promised reform, but dined with the very men they claimed to oppose. There was talk of a shipment arriving soon, larger than any before, enough to flood the streets for months. No one knew quite when, but everyone felt it coming, like a storm that darkened the edges of the sky. Eleanor stood by the river one night, watching the water carry away scraps of straw and broken bottles. The city lights shimmered on its surface, and behind her the alley stirred with restless movement. Somewhere a child cried. Somewhere else a song rose, sweet and cracked with drink. She knew she was only seeing the surface, that the true depth of it lay hidden in rooms she could not yet enter, in ledgers she had not yet seen. The night was cold, and the wind carried the smell of smoke and damp stone. Gin Alley waited, as it always did, for another dawn that would bring no answers, only more questions. The tension lingered like the frost on the windows, and in the silence before the bells rang for morning, the city held its breath. The night pressed on, and the streets of London refused to quiet. A chill set in, creeping along the narrow alleys where cobblestones glistened with the dampness of the river air. Thomas pulled his coat tighter as he crossed toward the heart of the city, trying to ignore the laughter spilling from a doorway just ahead. It was laughter that didn't quite sound joyful, more like a hollow echo of something that used to be cheerful, now turned bitter with drink. Inside, the dim light revealed faces slack with exhaustion, yet restless, driven by the need to escape the cold reality waiting beyond the tavern door. Mothers nursed infants with cups meant for gin. Men argued over debts they couldn't repay. And in the corner, a girl of no more than 14 stared into her empty glass, her eyes unfocused. Elsewhere, the city's planners debated what was to be done. At Westminster, meetings dragged on deep into the evening, candles burning low as lawmakers discussed taxes, trade, and how gin had become both a lifeline and a poison for the working poor. They argued that the people had chosen their fate, that no law could force them to drink water fouled by the city's filth. Some spoke of stricter controls. Others insisted that removing gin would only breed unrest. Outside those grand halls, no one knew what was said, only that nothing seemed to change. Martha, the woman who had once been a midwife before her hands trembled too much to hold the tools, sat by the docks and wondered if the city had simply forgotten them all. She had seen too much in her 40 years. The way men sold their wedding rings for one more bottle. The way mothers buried children who had known more thirst than comfort. And still, every morning, the merchants came with carts rattling and bottles clinking, shouting their offers to the same tired streets. She remembered when bread was the cry that filled the air. Now was gin. Each corner of the city had its own story. In the alleys near Bishopsgate, young apprentices found themselves trapped in debts to their masters, paid in drink rather than coin. Near Fleet Street, writers and pamphleteers scrawled warnings that no one read, their ink running thin as their patience. And in Covent Garden, where music and laughter still fought to hold their place, the same drink that loosened tongues also loosened morals, leaving reputations scattered like broken glass. The conflict wasn't just about the drink. It was about what lay beneath it, the poverty, the hunger, the sense that nothing in this city was fair. Those who owned the distilleries grew fat from the profits, their homes lined with fine wood and warm light, while the ones who served in their shops slept on straw behind locked doors. The cries for reform were growing, but reform meant risk, and risk was a word spoken only in whispers when your livelihood rested on the very thing that was destroying your neighbor. Thomas, who had once thought of leaving London, now stayed because leaving felt like giving up. He had taken work at the docks unloading barrels, their pungent scent clinging to his clothes no matter how hard he scrubbed. Each day, he saw the same men and women come to collect their share, the same arguments with the collectors, the same quiet collapses in the corners where no one had the strength to rise. Yet, sometimes in the gray hours before dawn, he wondered if there was more to this plague of drink than simple craving. Why did it spread so quickly, so deeply? Why did it seem as though the city wanted its poor to remain this way? Docile, distracted, forgetful of their own misery. Rumors drifted through the city like smoke. Some said the government turned a blind eye because taxes from gin lined the coffers. Others claimed that foreign merchants had flooded the city with cheap spirits to break its back from within. A few whispered darker things, of hidden deals struck in candlelit rooms, where men in powdered wigs agreed that a drunken city was easier to rule. No one knew the truth, and perhaps that was the worst of it. In a place already choked with fog, truth was the thing most easily lost. Martha heard those rumors too. She kept them tucked away like old letters, folded and hidden beneath the floorboards of her mind. Once, she might have laughed them off. Now, she wasn't so sure. Too many faces had vanished. Too many streets had grown quiet at the wrong hour. Too many children had learned to cry, without tears because their bodies held nothing left to give. On a night heavy with damp air, she crossed paths with Thomas outside the tavern where the laughter had turned sour. They shared a brief exchange, Nothing remarkable, just a recognition that they had both seen too much. Thomas spoke of the docks and the barrels that never seemed to run dry. Martha spoke of mothers who begged her to find work for them that did not involve pouring poison for strangers. And somewhere in that brief conversation, a question settled between them. What would happen if the city reached its breaking point? In the wealthy districts, men in tailored coats spoke of opportunity. Gin had built fortunes. It had also bought silence. But even there, in the soft glow of their parlors, they heard the noise from the poorer streets. Arguments, songs, the crash of bottles. They sent their children to the country for safety, but safety was not something that could be bought forever. The city was too small for such divisions to remain walls. Through it all, the Thames rolled on, its black waters carrying whispers from one side of London to the other. Barges moved quietly at night, their cargo unchecked by the weary watchmen. Lanterns flickered on the banks where men counted coins, their breath fogging in the chill. Somewhere out there, the next shipment was already on its way, another river of gin to drown the cries for bread and fairness. The main conflict was no longer just in the drink, but in the hearts of those who had begun to see its chains. Could they stand against it? Could they survive without it? Every answer seemed to lead to another question, every step forward met by a shadow that stretched longer than the last. Martha began keeping notes, not of names, for that was dangerous, but of places, patterns, moments when the tide of gin seemed to move faster than the people could resist. She kept them hidden, and each time she wrote, she felt the air around her grow colder, as though someone might be watching. Thomas, too, found himself drawn into a circle he did not fully understand. A man at the docks had spoken of a meeting, a quiet one, where those tired of the drinks hold would gather. But meetings in London were not always what they seemed. Some ended in arrests, others in silence that never lifted. Still, he considered going, because in a city that could not sleep, someone had to remain awake. And so the night carried on, and the city waited. The tavern stayed open, the barrels kept rolling, and the cries for change drifted just above the fog. Somewhere between the sound of a baby's cry and the clink of another empty bottle, the real question took shape. Not just who would rise against this tide, but whether the city itself wanted to be saved at all. The streets of London seemed to narrow as winter deepened, and Gin Alley felt more like a trap than a place where people could live. The smell of damp straw and sour drink clung to the air, and each evening, the shadows grew longer and thicker, like they were trying to swallow the cobbled lanes whole. Margaret found herself walking the same stretch each day, watching the familiar faces grow thinner, paler, more desperate. The taverns no longer roared with cheer. They hummed with a restless energy, a kind of quiet chaos that warned something bigger was coming. The city had become a stage, and everyone was part of a slow, stumbling act that felt like it could collapse at any moment. The talk of riots had grown louder, whispered in corners, and hinted at with sharp looks from behind frosted windows. Prices for bread had crept up again, and with every rise, another household fell into ruin. Margaret overheard men plotting near the river, speaking of marching to the magistrate's house or blocking the gin carts before they reached the market. Others spoke of taking matters into their own hands, cutting the barrels open so the poison would spill into the gutter rather than their children's mouths. The tension was not just about drink anymore. It was about being heard in a city that seemed deaf to the cries of its own people. One night, as the frost crept across the glass panes like a web, Margaret was called to a small house near Bishopsgate. A woman there had gone quiet after giving birth, her eyes wide and unfocused, her lips cracked from thirst. A neighbor whispered that her husband had been seen selling the baby's blanket for a cup of gin. Margaret could not be sure if it was true, but the hollow silence in that room told a story of its own. The cries of the newborn, thin and uncertain, seemed to echo the whole of Gin Alley, fragile, clinging, waiting for warmth that never came. At the same time, across the city, a magistrate sat in a candlelit office, drafting another law to limit the sale of spirits. His words were stern, full of duty, but his ink-stained fingers trembled. He knew the merchants who sold the gin were powerful, their pockets deep, their friends seated in places far above his reach. Each time he signed a paper, a letter arrived the next morning, reminding him of debts he owed, of promises whispered in Parliament corridors. It was a game of pressure, and he was no better shielded from it than the beggar shivering outside his door. Nathaniel, the writer who had begun sketching the scenes of Gin Alley, found his own nights restless. His pages were filled with images of men slumped in doorways, of women clutching empty bottles as though they were lifelines. But the more he wrote, the more he saw the faces behind those sketches, faces of neighbors, of distant cousins, of the very people who had once laughed in the fields outside the city before they were drawn here by the promise of work. His pen scraped across the paper late into the night, capturing not just the ruin, but the reasons behind it. Cheap drink, yes, but also cold winters, unfair wages, and the endless hunger that made the warm fog of gin feel like mercy. In the alleyways, the children grew sharper-eyed. They learned which doors to knock on for a crust of bread, which cellar steps to avoid, where the constables lingered at dusk. They were the small shadows of Gin Alley, slipping between feet, trading whispers for scraps. Margaret noticed one boy in particular, a wiry figure named Samuel who had a way of appearing when no one expected. He watched the drinkers, watched the merchants, and sometimes followed the city runners when they came to collect debts. There was something in his gaze that felt older than his years, as if the city had written its lessons deep into his bones. As Christmas neared, a bitter wind swept through the markets, rattling the thin shutters and carrying with it the promise of more nights without coal. The tavern stayed full, their doors swinging with the coming and going of men who had nothing left to trade but their own tools. Some pawned their coats for a bottle, others offered labor they no longer had the strength to give. And all the while, the church bells tolled in the distance, a sound that once promised hope, but now only seemed to mark the passing of another cold hour. Rumors began to circulate of a shipment, one unlike the others, that would pass through the heart of Gin Alley. It was said to hold barrels stronger than anything sold before, a new batch from the docks that could bring merchants a fortune and push the alley over its edge. The whispers said it would arrive under cover of night, guarded but not too well, for the merchants had grown careless in their greed. Nathaniel heard it from a printer who owed him a favor. Margaret heard it from a boy whose father worked the docks. Both felt the weight of it like a stone in their chest. If that shipment came, what little balance the alley had left might crumble entirely. The night before the barrels were to arrive, the alley seemed to hold its breath. Men lingered near doorways, their hands hidden in their coats. Women peered from windows with no candles lit. Even the rats moved more quietly, scurrying along the edges of the street as if sensing the storm about to break. Margaret wrapped her shawl tight and walked the lane, her feet crunching on the frost, her mind heavy with the faces she had seen. Nathaniel was somewhere behind her, his notebook in his pocket, unsure whether he was there to watch or to warn. Farther down, a figure stepped from the shadows, a man with a scar across his cheek, one of the merchant's guards. He glanced at Margaret, then at Nathaniel, his eyes sharp and searching. "Best be home tonight," he muttered, his voice low but carrying in the still air. "Storm's coming, and it won't be the weather that bites." And still, the barrels were coming. Hidden in the cold, damp fog of London's docks, they waited to be rolled across the cobbles, down into the heart of a city already aching. The alley would not sleep that night. It would hold its breath, waiting to see who would claim the first spill, who would light the first spark, who would take the first fall when the weight of it all came crashing down. The winter deepened, and with it, the streets of London grew colder, darker, and strangely louder at night. The cold wind rattled the crooked shutters of houses in Gin Alley, carrying with it the cries of infants, the coughs of the sick, and the sound of bottles clinking in the hands of men who stumbled home with empty pockets and heavy hearts. The tension was no longer hidden. It was everywhere, in every whispered conversation at the market, in the glances shared between neighbors, in the quiet tears of those who feared the nights more than the days. People were starting to believe the city itself had turned against them. In the corners of taverns, there was talk of something building, something bigger than just drunken quarrels or debts unpaid. Men spoke of strange meetings in the alleys after midnight, where figures cloaked in shadows traded whispers instead of goods. Women swore they saw carts moving through the streets with no drivers, carrying crates that rattled with glass but were delivered to no known address. Children were sent inside earlier and earlier, mothers saying it was the cold, but their eyes gave away that it was something else, something they could not name. The public houses, once noisy with careless laughter, were becoming stages for heated arguments. James, the weary watchman, heard them all during his rounds. He listened as men argued over the price of gin, over wages that never came, over food that cost more than it was worth. The same names kept coming up: landlords who raised rents without reason, merchants who watered down their spirits but doubled their prices, men in fine coats who promised reform and vanished as quickly as they came. Yet the blame always seemed to settle on those at the bottom, the ones who drank not for pleasure but because it numbed the cold and hunger. Sarah's shop had become an unintended meeting point for those who still had a shred of hope left. Her remedies for coughs and headaches were simple, her bread often shared with those who could not pay. She listened as people spoke of strange illnesses spreading, not just the usual winter fevers, but something heavier, something that took hold of a man's mind as much as his body. Some blamed the gin, saying it was no longer what it used to be. Others whispered of poisons added to keep the poor drunk and docile, to stop them from asking questions. Then there were the patrols, more frequent now, and not always the familiar faces of the old watchmen. Men in new uniforms walked the streets, their boots polished, their eyes cold. They said it was for safety, to keep the peace, but James knew better. Peace was rarely the goal in these parts. Control was. They stood near taverns at night, not to protect the people inside, but to watch them, to remember their faces, to take note of who stayed out too late, who shouted too loudly, who dared to complain. The city felt like a kettle left on the fire too long. Steam built in its streets and cellars, in the hearts of those who had nothing left to lose. There were rumors of a strike at the docks, whispers of men refusing to unload barrels they claimed were cursed. In the markets, women argued with merchants until tears cut tracks down their frostbitten cheeks. Even the church bells seemed to toll heavier, their echoes carrying more sorrow than prayer. And through it all, the gin flowed. It seeped into every crack of the city like water through a broken roof. Cheap, bitter, and burning, it was the only warmth many could find, and the only escape they could afford. Mothers gave it to their children to quiet their cries. Fathers drank it before work to dull the ache of hunger. There were nights when the air itself smelled of it, sharp and sour, clinging to coats and hair and the damp brick walls of Gin Alley. One bitter evening, as the fog thickened to the point where even the lamps seemed to shiver, James followed the sound of a crash down a narrow lane. There he found a man on his knees, clutching a broken bottle, staring at something in the dark that James could not see. The man's lips moved, but no words came out, only a low, dry wheeze. When James placed a hand on his shoulder, the man jolted as though waking from a dream and whispered a single word: cellar. Then he stumbled away, leaving the shards behind. The word stuck in James's mind as he walked his route. Cellars were everywhere in this part of London. Places where gin was stored, where debts were collected, where secrets were kept. But whose cellar? And what was inside? He thought of Sarah, of the worried lines that had deepened on her face over the past weeks, of the children who no longer played in the alley but huddled near their doors, waiting for fathers who didn't come home. The next day, Sarah overheard a conversation in her shop between two women who spoke in hushed tones. One mentioned a shipment that had arrived before dawn, delivered to the back of the old mill. The other said her husband had seen men guarding it, men he didn't recognize. They weren't locals. Their clothes were finer, their accents strange, and they carried themselves with the kind of authority that didn't answer questions. More names were whispered that week, not the names of thieves or pickpockets, but names that belonged to the higher streets, the ones with lamps that burned longer and pavements that stayed clean. There was talk of a man with influence, a brewer who had no brewery anyone could find, of a woman with a ledger that contained more secrets than sums. Of a house where the windows never opened and the servants never left. As the days passed, the tension drew tighter, like rope around a struggling figure. Winter markets closed earlier. Taverns locked their doors at midnight whether or not the patrons wished it. The laughter that once rose with the gin was quieter now, edged with something sharp. People were watching each other, not with friendliness, but with suspicion. Then came a night of the frost that did not lift. The streets turned to glass beneath the lamplight, and the city held its breath. James found himself standing before a locked cellar door he had passed 100 times before, but that night it was ajar. A faint light flickered from within, and the smell, strong, metallic, and wrong, drifted out into the street. He thought of leaving it be, of finishing his round, and letting the mystery remain just another story for the taverns. But something in the stillness held him there. Far across the alley, Sarah stood in her doorway, watching the same door, clutching her shawl tight against the cold. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. But both knew that something was about to happen, something that would not be easily undone. The nights grew heavier as autumn sank its teeth into London. The streets of Gin Alley became darker, the air colder, and the people more restless. It was as if the very ground beneath their feet had soaked up every spilled drop of gin and was now exhaling its fumes back into the night. Tobias began to notice more missing faces, people who once crowded the doorways and corners now gone without a word. Some said they had moved away to find honest work, but others whispered they had simply vanished, leaving behind only unpaid debts and unanswered questions. Margaret's once steady hands began to tremble in the mornings, and she found herself gripping the edge of the bed just to keep her balance when the sun rose over the foggy streets. Even the tavern owners, who had once thrived on the steady flow of gin drinkers, began to look uneasy. They were caught between profit and the strange feeling that the very life was draining from the alley. One such man, an aging innkeeper named Barnaby, spoke in hushed tones one evening to Tobias. "It's not just the drink, lad," he said, leaning across the bar, his voice nearly swallowed by the noise of a busy night. "There's something about this place now. The nights are longer, and the faces are changing. It's not the same as it used to be." His words lingered with Tobias long after he stepped outside. The constables, few and poorly paid, turned a blind eye. Their rounds were more of a formality than a safeguard, and often they disappeared into the warmth of a back room rather than face the chill of Gin Alley after dark. Rumors grew of backdoor trades, barrels being exchanged for silence, money changing hands to overlook certain dealings that went far beyond gin. A boy named Edwin, who worked as a runner for the fishmongers by day, began to spend his evenings carrying small packages wrapped in cloth for men whose names no one seemed to know. Tobias caught sight of him once, the boy's face pale under the flickering lamplight, but when their eyes met, Edwin vanished into the shadows without a word. Margaret grew more desperate as the months went on. Her father's small collection of books, once her comfort, gathered dust on the shelf. Her mother's hands, once firm in their care, now trembled with a kind of helplessness that Margaret could not bear to watch. The gin had taken something from their home, something silent and unseen, but heavy enough to be felt in every room. One night, when the air outside was thick with mist, she overheard her parents whispering. Her father spoke of selling his tools, of moving further east, away from the alley, but her mother hesitated. "What if it follows us?" she asked, her voice thin and afraid. "It's not just the place anymore. It's the people. It's in them." There were whispers, too, of something happening at the edge of the city, where new houses were rising and fields were being fenced. A place where gin did not flow so freely, where men spoke of fresh starts and clean air. But few from Gin Alley ever made it there. The journey cost money, and most had none to spare. Even those who managed to save often found their plans undone by a night of drink or an unexpected debt. It was as if the alley itself conspired to keep its people close, wrapped in the haze of its narrow streets. Tobias began to spend his nights walking further than before, exploring streets that felt less weighed down by the fumes. He He saw families sitting together by small fires, their windows dim, but their eyes clearer than those of his neighbors. Yet he always returned, drawn back by something he could not quite name. Perhaps it was the promise he had made to his father, or the pull of familiar voices, or maybe it was something deeper, something in the cobblestones that held him like a net. As winter set in, the sickness returned, sharper than before. Children coughed in the night, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, and the old ones stopped coming out altogether. One morning, a wagon creaked down the lane, its wheels thick with mud, and left with more than it came with. No one spoke of it after it was gone. That night, Tobias stood by the corner where the gaslight flickered and thought he saw someone watching from across the alley, a shape in the mist that moved when he blinked but was gone when he stepped closer. Margaret noticed it too, the feeling of eyes where there were none. She told her mother once, but her mother only shook her head and told her to sleep. The alley had always had its watchers, the landlords, the debt collectors, the constables when they were sober. But this was different. This felt colder, quieter, and as the nights stretched longer, the fog thicker, the watchers seemed to draw nearer. Then came a night when the bell tolled twice at the hour when it should have tolled once. No one could explain it, but the sound carried down the alley like a warning. Barnaby swore he saw someone leave the churchyard in the moments after, a figure wrapped in a dark coat, their head turned low. Tobias heard the bell and felt the weight of it in his chest, as though the sound itself carried meaning he could not yet name. The gin shop stayed open later after that. Whether out of fear or defiance, no one could say. But the nights grew louder, rougher, and more desperate. Deals were made in the corners, debts written on scraps of paper, promises whispered in exchange for bottles that burned like fire. Tobias began to wonder if there was something more than drink at the heart of it, something being fed by every lost hour and every coin traded for another taste. Margaret, meanwhile, watched her father's shoulders stoop lower each day. His hands, once skilled and steady, now struggled with the simplest of repairs. The neighbors spoke of a time before the alley turned, before the drink became its lifeblood, when the streets were rough but not yet hollowed. But no one could say when that time had passed, or how. The cold bit deeper as the year turned. A wind began to whistle through the narrow lanes, carrying with it the sound of distant carriages and the faint smell of coal from the wealthier streets. It felt like another world was just beyond their reach, one with warmth and quiet and nights that ended in peace. But Gin Alley held them fast. On one of those nights, when the moon was a pale sliver in the fog, Tobias thought he heard someone calling his name. He turned, but the street was empty. Only the flicker of a dying lantern lit the stones. He walked faster after that, his heart quickening though he could not say why. Somewhere behind him, the echo of his own footsteps sounded just a little too close. Would you like me to continue with the next 1,000 words leading directly into the climax, where the mystery deepens and the unseen forces in Gin Alley start to show their true influence? The phone call changed everything. It came late in the evening, just as the quiet of the night was beginning to settle in, and the sound of it made the room feel colder than it had a moment ago. Alex answered, his voice low, almost cautious, and the words on the other end were sharp and heavy. There had been another incident, one that connected directly to the trail they were following. This was no coincidence. It was deliberate. It meant someone was watching them more closely than they had thought. And worse, someone was waiting for the perfect moment to act. The details were scarce, but the urgency in the caller's voice was enough to make Alex's pulse race. By the time he hung up, the air in the room felt tense. Jenna looked at him from across the table, her brow furrowed, sensing the weight in his silence. "What happened?" she asked, but he didn't answer right away. He was still trying to piece together what little he had heard, his mind racing through every possibility. Could this have been planned from the start? Were they being drawn deeper into a web that was far bigger than they had imagined? The sense of being a step behind, of being manipulated, gnawed at him. Outside, the streets were quiet, but something about the stillness now felt wrong, like the calm before a storm that no one else could see coming. They decided to move fast, knowing that hesitation could mean losing everything they had worked to uncover. But as they gathered their notes and left the room, neither of them realized that they were being followed again. A car, parked just far enough to avoid suspicion, started its engine and rolled slowly behind them. On the way, Alex replayed the last few weeks in his mind. The clues they had chased, the people they had spoken to, the documents that had mysteriously disappeared right after they were discovered. It all painted a picture that was becoming clearer by the day. This wasn't just about one mistake or one secret being hidden. This was something organized, something that involved more people than either of them had first thought. It wasn't just a single thread anymore. It was a network, and pulling at one part was starting to unravel others. The next stop brought them to a place that felt out of time. An old office on the edge of town, where the lights still burned late into the night. The person they were supposed to meet, there was said to have information, but no one had ever really seen them speak publicly. It was a risk, maybe even a trap, but they couldn't turn away now. The closer they got, the more they could feel the pressure building, like they were standing on the edge of something about to break wide open. Inside, the smell of dust and paper filled the air. Files were stacked on shelves, old cabinets lining the walls, the kind of place where stories were buried rather than told. And then a voice came from the corner, a voice that seemed to know them, even though they had never met before. The figure stepped into the dim light, their face half-shadowed, and started talking not about what was happening now, but about what had happened years ago, long before Alex and Jenna ever got involved. It turned out the roots of this conflict went deeper than anyone had been willing to admit. There had been deals made in silence, mistakes covered up, and people who had simply vanished because they knew too much. This wasn't just a recent chain of events. It was the latest in a long history of things being hidden away from sight. And now, someone had decided it was time to make sure the truth stayed buried, no matter who stood in the way. The revelation shook them both, but also left them with more questions than answers. If this was the real story, then why reveal it now? And what did this informant stand to gain from sharing it? The feeling in the room shifted quickly from relief to unease. It was as if they had been handed a key, but weren't sure which door it opened, or whether opening it would set off something far worse. As they left, the night had grown darker. Rain had started to fall, turning the streets slick and empty, the glow of the streetlights bending in the wet pavement. Jenna walked in silence, her thoughts racing. She had joined this because she believed in uncovering the truth, in exposing what others tried to hide, but the closer they got to the heart of it, the more dangerous it became. Not just for them, but for the people connected to them, people who had no idea they were now part of something so tangled. Then, as they approached their car, a shadow moved quickly behind them. It wasn't just someone passing by. It was deliberate, quick, and calculated. Alex caught the movement out of the corner of his eye, his hand instinctively reaching for the door handle, ready to act. But before he could, a small envelope was slipped under the windshield wiper, and the figure disappeared into the rain-soaked night without a word. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with only one sentence. "You're getting too close." There was no signature, no other message, just that warning. And suddenly, everything felt heavier. It was no longer just about finding answers. It was about staying one step ahead of something that clearly didn't want them to succeed. They sat in the car for a long moment, the sound of the rain drumming against the roof, each of them thinking the same thing, but neither wanting to say it aloud. They were being watched from every angle. And whoever was behind it was now done hiding in the shadows. They were sending messages. This second twist changed the stakes completely. What they thought was a pursuit of truth had now become a game of survival, where each move had to be calculated, and every decision carried the risk of pulling them deeper into something they might not escape from. And as they drove off, headlights trailing behind them, the city seemed to close in, the rain washing the streets clean, but leaving behind a sense that something much bigger was coming, and soon. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost unnatural, as the clock ticked past midnight. Rebecca sat at the edge of the table, her eyes tracing the same faded map for the 100th time, her thoughts spinning faster than the hands of the clock. Navarro leaned back in his chair, the dim glow from the single overhead bulb casting sharp lines on his face. Both of them had been at this for hours, and neither was willing to say aloud what the other feared. This wasn't just another lead. This was the unraveling of something much bigger, and it was happening right under their noses. The documents scattered across the table had started as a collection of small clues, but now they pointed to something organized, layered, and disturbingly meticulous. Outside, the rain had picked up again, drumming softly against the windows like a warning neither of them could quite decipher. Rebecca finally broke the silence. If these names are connected, and if Subject 12 is truly part of this, then it means someone's been watching this city for decades. Maybe longer. Navarro didn't respond at first. He was busy scrolling through the encrypted files they had retrieved, files they weren't even sure they were supposed to have. What if it's not just about watching? He said finally, his voice low. What if it's about selecting? That word lingered in the air. Selecting. It carried weight now. The names on the list weren't random. They followed a pattern, one that matched disappearances, sealed cases, and files that had been archived so deeply it took 3 different clearance levels to even find them. Rebecca's hand tightened around her coffee cup. Then why leave a trail? Why let us get this far? She whispered. Navarro shook his head. Maybe they didn't let us. Maybe this is the trail they wanted us to follow. The realization settled in slowly. This wasn't just about finding a person or solving a case anymore. They were walking into a trap designed to look like an investigation. And the closer they got, the less sure they were of who was pulling the strings. Every file they opened led to another shadow, another story buried under years of silence. It was then that Rebecca noticed something in the corner of one of the scan files. A date. It wasn't recent. It was decades old. Yet, next to it, a digital signature had been updated just days ago. That shouldn't have been possible. Her stomach turned. Someone was still editing these files. Someone with access, someone who knew exactly what they were looking at and when. Navarro leaned in when she pointed it out, his brow furrowing. So they know we're in, he said. They've known since the moment we opened the first file. The thought sent a chill down both their spines. Every step they had taken, every conversation they thought was private, could have been part of the script all along. Then the phone rang. Not the office line, the secure, encrypted one they barely used. Rebecca answered, her voice steady, but her hand trembling slightly. There was no greeting, no introduction. Just a single sentence that felt like a blade across the room. Stop digging, or you'll be next. The line went dead. They stared at each other, the quiet now suffocating. Neither spoke for a long time. It wasn't fear that held them still. It was the realization that they had already gone too far to turn back. Navarro stood and began pacing, his mind racing. We need to know who's feeding us this and why now. This isn't about the files anymore. It's about control. Rebecca nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The list of names. The pattern. The strange boy, Subject 12, who hadn't aged in decades. There was a link there, one they were still missing. And then it hit her. What if the boy isn't the target? She said slowly. What if he's the key? Navarro stopped in his tracks. Key to what? To all of it, she whispered. The names, the disappearances, the sealed records. Maybe he's the one thing they can't erase, so they built everything else around him. To hide him, or to use him. The theory was wild, but in a case like this, wild was starting to look like the truth. They decided to split their focus. Navarro would dig into the infrastructure behind the encrypted signatures, and Rebecca would trace the physical movements tied to those old case files. Somewhere between the digital shadows and the real world, the truth had to be waiting. The next day, as dawn broke over the city, Rebecca followed one of the leads to a forgotten part of town, a row of abandoned buildings that had once been part of a government research wing. The air smelled of rust and damp concrete. Her footsteps echoed as she stepped over broken glass, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. At the same time, Navarro was back at the office, using every contact he had left to trace the anonymous call. It was a dead end, rerouted through multiple layers of encryption. But one thing stood out, the timing. The call came exactly 1 hour after they accessed a folder marked archive_12. It wasn't just a coincidence. Back in the abandoned building, Rebecca found something strange. A room with walls lined in photographs, faded, curling at the edges, but meticulously arranged. Men, women, children, all with the same subtle mark somewhere on their bodies. Some on the wrist, some behind the ear. A mark that matched what they had seen in the old medical files of Subject 12. Her heart pounded as she took a step back. This wasn't just storage. It was a record, a catalog. And at the center of the room, under a cracked skylight, was an empty chair with restraints still attached. Recently used. She heard a sound behind her, just a faint creak of metal shifting underweight. She spun around, but the corridor was empty. Still, the air felt charged like she was being watched. She snapped a photo of the room, her hands barely steady, and backed out slowly. Navarro's message came through as she stepped outside. They moved him. Just last night. Someone tipped them off. Her pulse quickened. "They know we're here," she muttered under her breath, scanning the street for anything out of place. The rain had started again, masking the distant hum of a car engine that shut off just around the corner. Every instinct in her body told her they were no longer one step behind. They were being led, carefully, deliberately, into something much larger than either of them had signed up for. And now, with the evidence in hand and the names on that list still haunting them, the stakes had shifted. It wasn't just about finding the boy anymore. It was about survival. The silence in the room felt heavier than before, each breath drawn with a quiet strain, as though even the air knew something was about to give way. The second twist had landed like a shadow, creeping in from the corner, subtle, slow, yet impossible to ignore. What had seemed like a clear path forward now felt fractured, uncertain, and far more dangerous. Conversations turned sharper, eyes darted in the dim light, and trust, once fragile, began to splinter further. The stakes, already high, climbed another rung, and the sense of being watched, of being outplayed, settled over them like a chill that wouldn't leave. Small details began to make sense in strange ways. A phone call that had been cut short. A familiar car parked 2 streets away, showing up again in a different neighborhood. A stranger who seemed to linger just a moment too long near the cafe window. These moments threaded together like a thin wire pulled tight across their path. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was proof that the pieces on the board had moved again, and this time, someone else was making the rules. The main conflict no longer felt like a single force pressing against them. It felt like multiple layers, twisting around each other, each waiting for its moment to strike. One of them started digging quietly, hoping to find answers without drawing too much attention. Old records, recent messages, forgotten connections. They painted a picture that was far more complicated than the one they thought they were part of. There were names that reappeared where they shouldn't have. Places that matched too neatly with dates that had been left unexplained. The more they looked, the less they trusted the timeline they had been following. It wasn't just about who was behind the curtain. It was about how many curtains there really were. Each layer they peeled back revealed another, darker one beneath. The second subplot began weaving its own thread through this chaos. A person they had once considered peripheral, a quiet observer, someone who had been written off as harmless, suddenly stepped into focus. Their presence in the past weeks had been constant, subtle, almost too subtle. And now, bits of evidence began to tie them closer to the recent upheaval. A conversation overheard here, a seemingly innocent gesture there. It all added up to someone who wasn't just watching, but guiding the chaos from behind a carefully drawn mask. What was their role? Were they ally or enemy? Or worse, both, depending on what they stood to gain? Meanwhile, the group's cohesion began to fracture. Doubts spread quietly, but they were no less damaging. One whispered that another had shared information they shouldn't have. Another wondered aloud if their plan had been compromised from the start. Even the most steadfast among them began to flinch at small things. A glance too quick, a word said with the wrong inflection, a message that came a little too late. It wasn't open conflict, not yet, but the roots of mistrust were deepening, wrapping around every decision they made. Each choice felt heavier now, each step riskier than the last. Outside forces added to the pressure, too. There were reports, small at first, of surveillance tightening. questions being asked by people who rarely cared before. A knock at the door from someone who claimed to be following up on something minor, but lingered a moment too long, eyes scanning the hallway. It all hinted at a larger movement beyond their control, as if the main conflict had started to draw attention from places they hadn't planned for. It wasn't just a game of staying ahead anymore. It was about survival, in a space where the walls seemed to close in from every direction. They debated quietly one night, voices hushed though the room was empty except for them. The question wasn't just what to do next, but who to trust with the next step. The plan they had relied on no longer felt like a path forward, more like a trail that had been baited from the start. The second twist had shown them that. There was someone feeding both sides, someone who wanted the pressure to build, the mistakes to multiply, the missteps to become irreversible. Every new clue they uncovered felt like a thread in a much larger web, and now they had to wonder, were they spiders or flies? As the days turned into restless nights, the tension mounted. The mystery surrounding their adversary or adversaries deepened, but so too did their awareness that not everything they feared was coming from the outside. There were moments now when they caught themselves hesitating, glancing over shoulders, listening for footsteps in empty halls. The very act of trying to protect themselves had started to look like suspicion to others. Each decision was now a gamble. Act too soon and risk exposure. Act too late and risk being swept under by a tide they couldn't see clearly. Somewhere in all this, a faint trail of answers appeared. It wasn't a breakthrough, not yet, but it was enough to suggest that the second twist was not just a random turn of events. It had been set in motion long before they realized they were in the middle of it. The connections stretched back further, touching places and names that should have been irrelevant. Someone had been patient, deliberate, and quietly effective at keeping their role hidden until now. And that realization made the whole situation far more dangerous. If they had missed it this long, what else had they missed? A late-night message arrived, a single sentence, and signed, untraceable. You're asking the wrong questions. It didn't say what the right ones were. It didn't threaten, didn't warn. It simply shifted the ground beneath them again, leaving them to wonder if their entire line of thinking had been a well-laid trap. The second plot twist wasn't just about what had been hidden. It was about how deep the misdirection ran, and how many layers of the truth had been rewritten before they even began to dig. They moved more cautiously now, every conversation carried with deliberate pauses, every meeting held with a quiet check of the exits. The climax was coming. They could feel it in the way events began to accelerate without their consent. Someone was pulling them toward it, tightening the rope just enough to make sure they couldn't walk away. And yet, they still didn't know the full shape of what they were walking into. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the flickering lights above like fractured mirrors. The team stood on edge, the air thick with the kind of silence that came only before something irreversible happened. Navarro's voice was low, calm, but beneath it was an urgency everyone could feel. They had tracked the network for weeks, pulled at threads that seemed to lead nowhere, only for them to tangle again into a knot. But now, that knot was beginning to unravel. Subject 12 stood at the far end of the corridor, his face pale, his hands slightly trembling. There was something in his expression, a mixture of fear and resolve, as if he had known all along that this night would come. Rebecca stepped forward, her mind racing with every conversation, every hidden clue, every dark corner of the investigation that had brought them here. The building around them was cold, the walls marked by years of forgotten secrets. Somewhere within, the truth waited. But the truth was never just a simple thing. It always came with a cost. She glanced at Navarro, who gave her a brief nod. They were ready, or at least as ready as anyone could be. Then, the door at the end of the hall opened slowly. A figure stepped out, one they had not expected to see again, one they had been sure was gone. Jeremy, the man they had hunted, the one whose shadow had stretched over this entire case like a dark hand. But he looked different, not just older or weaker. There was a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a strange calm that sent a chill through the room. He raised his hands slowly, not in surrender, but in something closer to offering. "You've been chasing the wrong ghost," he said softly, his voice echoing against the walls. Rebecca froze. The team shifted, weapons half raised, but no one moved. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady though her heart pounded. Jeremy's gaze flicked toward Subject 12. "He's not just a witness. He's the reason it all began. And I was only ever the distraction." His words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, and for a moment, it felt like the floor beneath them had shifted. Navarro stepped closer, his tone sharp. "You're lying. You've been manipulating this from the start." Jeremy shook his head, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. "I wanted to stop it, believe it or not. I tried. But you can't stop something that was never meant to end. This place, these experiments, they don't just erase time, they rewrite it." Subject 12 finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "He's telling part of the truth," he said, and his words cut through the tension like a blade. "I remember now. I wasn't just kept hidden. I was kept alive because I was the key." Rebecca's breath caught. The pieces that had been scattered and mismatched for so long were starting to click into place, but the picture they formed was one that none of them wanted to see. Suddenly, the lights flickered, the air buzzing with a low hum. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, followed by the echo of hurried steps. The team tensed, and Rebecca reached instinctively for her weapon. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jeremy looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You still have a chance to walk away," he said quietly. "But if you go further, you'll see what they never wanted you to see. And once you do, you'll never come back the same." The floor trembled slightly, a deep vibration that ran through their feet. Rebecca felt it in her chest, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any of them. The network wasn't just a group of people. It was something alive, something buried deep beneath years of lies. Navarro cursed under his breath, scanning the hall for movement. "We're out of time," he muttered. But Rebecca didn't move. She looked at Subject 12, then at Jeremy, and finally at the dark corridor stretching behind them. She could feel the story pulling towards something massive, something final, but also something twisted. "Show me," she said at last. "No more running. No more half-truths. Show me everything." Jeremy hesitated, then slowly lowered his hands. "Very well," he said. "But remember, you asked for this." He turned, motioning for them to follow, and as they stepped through the door he had come from, the air grew colder, thicker. The walls were lined with old cables and rusted signs, each marked with numbers and dates that meant nothing to them, yet everything to someone long gone. Then came the sound, a low, rising hum that built into a steady pulse. It was coming from the chamber ahead, a place sealed off by a heavy door marked with a faded symbol none of them recognized. Subject 12 paled further, his breath quickening. "I've been here before," he whispered. "This is where it began." Rebecca reached for the handle. Her hand trembled, but she didn't pull away. Whatever was behind that door would change everything. She could feel it. And when it finally swung open, the room beyond was nothing like they expected. It wasn't just a lab. It was a gallery of lives, photographs, names, fragments of people who had been erased, rewritten, turned into something they were never meant to be. And at the center, a single chair, still warm, as if someone had just left it. Jeremy stepped inside, his voice hollow. "This is the heart of it. They called it the reset room. And this is where I lost everything." His words carried a weight that filled the chamber. The tension was unbearable now, every breath sharp, every second stretched too thin. Rebecca looked at the chair, then at Subject 12, then at Jeremy. The truth was here within reach, but it wasn't simple and it wasn't kind. It was something that would force them all to choose, whether to expose it, destroy it, or become a part of it. The climax was no longer a moment to fear. It was a door already opening, and behind it, the real fight was just beginning. The chaos that had consumed the city finally began to quiet, though the echoes of what had unfolded still lingered in every corner. Streets that once felt hostile now seemed oddly calm, as though they were catching their breath after holding it for too long. Samuel walked through them slowly, his steps heavy but steady. The tension that had carried him for weeks was finally lifting, leaving behind a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The people who had once looked at each other with suspicion were now beginning to speak again, to share their worries and their hopes. It was not a sudden transformation, but something fragile, built on the realization that what they had endured was not just about the events, but about how they had chosen to respond to them. Eleanor, who had once been at the heart of the whispers and doubts, found herself sitting by the window of her small home, watching the sunrise stretch across the rooftops. She had lost much in the process: time, trust, and the comfort of certainty. But she had gained something too. The truth had been revealed, and though it had shaken the city, it had also freed it. The web of lies that had tied everyone in knots was finally cut, leaving behind scars but also space to heal. She thought about the choices she had made, the nights she spent questioning her own courage, and how, in the end, standing firm had meant more than winning quickly. The final twist that had shocked everyone still felt raw. The revelation of the person pulling the strings, someone they had overlooked, someone they thought harmless, reminded them all how easily power hides in plain sight. It had not been about strength or force, but about influence, quiet moves that shifted the ground beneath them until they barely recognized where they stood. That truth would take time to settle. People were still talking in hushed tones, still trying to piece together how close they had come to losing more than they realized. But there was also relief, an unspoken sense that by facing what had been hidden, they had prevented something worse. In the days that followed, the city's heartbeat returned slowly. Meetings were held, not in secret, but in open spaces where voices could be heard. Samuel joined many of them, often standing at the back, not speaking until he felt his words might matter. He spoke not of blame, but of lessons, how fear grows when left unspoken, how trust can only return when everyone shares in the responsibility of keeping it. Eleanor, too, became a voice people listened to, not because she sought attention, but because she had lived the uncertainty alongside them and had chosen to stay even when it would have been easier to leave. The resolution was not a celebration, but a quiet rebuilding. The families who had been divided by suspicion began to share meals again. Shops reopened with cautious optimism. Children played in streets that had been empty for too long, their laughter carrying a sense of normalcy that adults had forgotten was possible. The scars were there, on faces, in stories, in memories, but they became reminders of resilience rather than wounds to hide. Samuel often thought of the moment when the turning point came, when the plan they feared would consume them all instead began to unravel. It was not a single act of heroism that saved them, but a series of choices, small, brave, often uncertain choices, that built toward change. It was a reminder that no matter how dark the night becomes, it is the quiet acts of courage that eventually bring the dawn. In the quiet after the storm, there were still questions. What would stop this from happening again? Could they truly trust those now tasked with rebuilding? Would the hidden networks that once thrived in the shadows return in a new form? These were not questions with easy answers, but they were questions people were now willing to ask openly. The fear of silence had been broken. Eleanor found herself writing again, something she had stopped doing in the thick of the turmoil. Her words were simple, just reflections on what she had seen, what she had felt, and what she hoped might come next. She wrote about the importance of speaking even when your voice shakes, about listening when you want to turn away, and about how sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to let go of hope. As for Samuel, he walked the familiar streets with a new kind of awareness. The city felt both smaller and larger now. Smaller because the facades had been stripped away, and larger because he finally saw the depth of the lives around him. Every face held a story, every corner a memory. He realized that true safety was never just about walls or watchmen, but about connection, how people stand for one another when it matters most. In the final days of summer, a gathering was held in the square where much of the tension had begun. It was not a ceremony, not even an event that had been formally planned. People simply showed up, some carrying lanterns, some just standing quietly. There were no speeches that night, only a shared moment of recognition. They had faced something that could have broken them, and instead, it had taught them who they were. The last remnants of the plan that had threatened them were dismantled piece by piece. Documents that had been hidden were brought into the light. Names were spoken without fear. And though not everyone involved faced the consequences they deserved, enough truth had been laid bare that the old patterns could not simply slip back unnoticed. In the end, what stayed with everyone was not the fear or the chaos, but the moments of unexpected humanity. A neighbor sharing food with a stranger. A young man stepping forward when others stepped back. A message whispered not in warning, but in solidarity. These small things, scattered across weeks of uncertainty, became the thread that held the city together. As autumn began to settle in, Samuel looked out across the river, the city's lights flickering like distant stars. He thought about how close they had come to losing everything that made this place worth fighting for, and how, somehow, they had managed to hold on. Not perfectly, not without cost, but enough. Eleanor joined him there one evening, standing beside him in the cool air. They did not speak at first. There was no need. The city had survived, and so had they. The story was not about victory in the traditional sense, but about endurance, about finding a way through without losing themselves completely. When people would look back on this time, they might not remember every detail of what was said or done, but they would remember the feeling, that moment when the fear broke, when the truth emerged, when they realized that even in the darkest hour, they still had a choice. And so, life began to move forward again, not as it had been, but as it could be, stronger in some ways, still tender in others. The streets filled with the ordinary sounds of living, footsteps, laughter, a distant song carried by the wind. The past was still there, but it no longer held them captive. Samuel walked home that night beneath a sky full of scattered stars, knowing the future was uncertain, but no longer afraid of it, because now they were awake, and that, more than anything, was their greatest strength.